We'll start. Hello, everybody. My name's Wendy Craig, and I'm the Scientific Director of PREVNet. And on behalf of our team, I'd like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. Wherever you're located, please join us in acknowledging and thanking the generations of Indigenous peoples who have cared for these lands and in celebrating the continued strength and spirit of Indigenous people. We are bringing today's webinar from the Community of Practice to address teen dating violence, funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada. We're really excited about this webinar, and today's webinar will focus on strategies for youth engagement, and it will be presented by Lachance and Faye Johnstone from Wisdom to Action. Before they start their presentation, just to build up anticipation, I'd like to just go through the webinar format for today. We will hear from our webinar speakers for about 45 minutes, and during their presentations, we invite you to type any comments or questions that you may have for them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we will track these questions and then pull from them and present them to Lisa and Faye at the end of their presentation during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. They welcome your questions in either French or English. At the end of the webinar, in the chat box, you will see a link to the evaluation, and that's the evaluation of this webinar. We really value the responses that people provide us through these evaluations, and they help guide us in planning for future webinars. So all of your feedback is anonymous, so please take, and it is really, not kidding, only 2 minutes at the end to complete the survey. Also, you should know that the webinar is being recorded today. So after the webinar, we will send out a link to everyone that registered so that they can share the recording, and we welcome you in sharing it. Or listen to it again because it's so fabulous. We will also share an English and French version of the slides that are presented today. So that's all the preamble, and so it's my pleasure, and I'm very excited to welcome and introduce and let them introduce themselves, Lisa and Faye. So I'm now going to turn over the presentation to them and take no more of your time because we're really here to listen to these wonderful experts. Okay, so now I have the challenge of sharing the presentation.
Oh, I think you sent the screens to me as opposed to Lisa.
And we practiced that too.
I believe in it. We're getting somewhere.
Okay, there we go. I see it. We're going to be fine. I'll get up there, play from start. There we go. So thank you so much, Wendy, for the warm welcome. And I know that there are folks out there from across the country and perhaps people that we've had the pleasure of connecting with and working with over the years. So, so welcome to everyone. Really looking forward to the conversation and questions at the end. As anyone who's connected with Listen to Action before knows, we take our name quite seriously, that we believe that everyone has wisdom to contribute and that we're all committed to action for positive outcomes for young people across the country. And I also just want to acknowledge Wendy's wonderful land acknowledgement. Listen to Action, we're based in Jiboutuk in Mi'kmaq, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. We've lived here in Nova Scotia under the Peace and Friendship Treaties since the mid-1700s, and so we are truly in Nova Scotia all treaty people. I'll quickly introduce myself and then hand it over to Faye. So I'm Lisa Lachance. I use she and they pronouns. I'm president of Wisdom to Action. I'm currently a doctoral student in health, and I've been involved in a lot of different movements and activisms across my lifespan, and really pleased to be doing this work with all of you today. Faye, do you want to jump in with your introduction?
Yeah, for sure. So hi, folks. My name is Faye Johnstone. I'm joining from Ottawa, Ontario. I use she and they pronouns and work as an affiliate with Wisdom to Action. But in terms of the work that I do, most of my work focuses on education and capacity building with social service providers around LGBTQ issues, but also any issues related to meaningful youth engagement. There's also my Twitter handle there, and you should also follow Wisdom to Action on Twitter if you would like, at Wisdom to Action. There's fun stuff, and we both tweet about it on occasion, so check it out.
Great, and Faye, do you want to take us through the learning objectives?
Yeah, For sure. So we have a few key pieces that we're hoping to dive into today. As you can see on the screen, a lot of it will focus on a basic understanding of youth engagement and just developing some common terminology around. And then we'll jump into building capacity to create and maintain safer spaces that are on one side inclusive and accepting of diverse identities, but also trauma-informed as well, which we see as often going very much hand in hand. We're also very big around youth engagement and facilitation. So how do we take these ideas and put them into practice? And how can we bring some facilitation techniques to the table that will help make that engagement more meaningful? We'll also talk a bit about engaging less vocal young folks who might not be the first ones to speak up in engagement contexts, thinking through some key considerations to make sure that any engagement that we are doing is genuinely meaningful, and then jumping and wrapping up with an emphasis on recruiting diverse young folks to the kind of work that we're doing.
Great, thank you. Now I'm having trouble changing my slide, but I'm sure it's going to happen. There we go. And so just a bit of background on Wisdom to Action and sort of our path here. So we were founded in 2011 along joining PREVNet as a knowledge mobilization network with a focus on supporting the mental health and well-being of vulnerable children and youth across Canada. And as part of our sort of legacy piece from that work, we've incorporated as a social enterprise. So we're still based here at Dalhousie University in Halifax. When I joined Wisdom to Action, which actually had a different name at the time, which was the Children and Youth in Challenging Context Network, we at that point there wasn't a youth advisory structure in place. So we had young people involved in a major network event. We had a young person on our board and had been really part of developing the Wisdom to Action network. But we didn't have a youth advisory structure. And I think at that time, some of the board members and some of our key partners were really trying to think about how youth engagement would work in that context, where we weren't doing research and we weren't providing services and we were doing knowledge mobilization, and what would that look like. So what we really found is that young people were really interested in being part of the Wisdom to Action work because we saw it as a chance to promote change at a sectoral level. So rather than going from service provider to service provider, advocating for best practices in youth engagement and other areas, this was a chance to sort of bring it up a level. And so young people, we've had a youth advisory committee since 2013. We had co-chairs on our governing board. Youth either identified their own priorities for events and reports and areas of focus, or co-led all of our activities. And so Faye, maybe you can talk a bit about your connection to Wisdom to Action and how you became involved.
So I've been around. I'm technically still a young person, though I always find it strange to exist as both somebody who works in this sector and is technically in the age range, because I'm 23. But I became involved with Wisdom to Action, I think formally for the first time about 1.5 years ago now. But I've been connected and I've met and known and worked alongside a lot of the Wisdom to Action folks for longer than that. But mostly a lot of my work has been focused around helping bring together facilitation teams and youth host teams to run some of the events that we've put on over the past couple of years. And then more recently, I've shifted towards doing more program coordination work with the organization. And it's been phenomenal. And again, I really love the approach of every time a project comes together, the first conversation is how does this relate to young people and how do we meaningfully engage young people in the work that we're doing? And I think that's a huge value to the sector and to make the work more impactful to the young folks at the end of the day. So we can talk all day about Wisdom to Action, and we would be happy to, but we also want to chat a bit about what is youth engagement. I find it's one of those things that we talk about abstractly all of the time, but very rarely actually give a definition to. And so here on the screen, you'll see 2 wonderful definitions. The first one is that youth engagement is the meaningful and sustained involvement of a young person in activity focusing outside of the self. Full engagement consists of a cognitive component, an affective component, and a behavioral component, also known as head, heart, feet, and spirit. I like this definition because it really demonstrates that young folks are supposed to be engaged, not just, helping volunteer in one capacity, not just in terms of being emotionally available at a space, but really across the board, that they're getting a range of experiences and benefits out of the engagement that they're involved in. The other definition here is from the New Mentality, who do some phenomenal youth engagement work focused on child and youth mental health in Ontario. And their definition is empowering all young people as valuable partners in addressing and making decisions about issues that affect them personally and or that they believe to be important. I love this definition for a couple reasons. I like the emphasis on empowering young people, so uplifting youth, but also not just uplifting young people, but engaging them as valuable partners. So it's really like an asset-based and strength-based approach to say, you know, we don't just want young people involved because they happen to be there or because we want to check a box, but we want young people involved as valuable partners because we know that they have unique, meaningful, and important contributions to make. And then engaging them in decisions around issues that are, again, personal to them. So, you know, a lot of our youth engagement is focused on issues that young people care about. It's, you know, in the mental health sector, it's in teen dating violence. But it's also about engaging young people in issues that they care about, that they believe and have to be important and that they have a passion around. And so I think together these two definitions really paint a holistic picture of, you know, engaging young people in a way that supports them, but also in a way that is valuable to the work that we do and to like improving the kinds of services and access to services young people have.
Great, thank you. And so I'm going to talk a bit about some of the evidence behind youth engagement. But before I do that, I'm actually going to invite people to do a little self-reflection exercise. And if you're sitting with a colleague, so much the better, you can share. And you know, and maybe even at the end, you can all share your words in via the chat function. So it's really the first time I've ever tried this exercise online, but I think it's an important one. So just asking you to reflect on a time when you felt truly engaged, when you felt you were truly able to participate in, it could be a conversation with a friend, it could be an outing with your family, it could be at a conference or a consultation or something sort of more formal. And so if you can think about that time and really evoke it, then also to think about 2 or 3 words that capture how you felt. So this is gonna feel really long on a webinar, but I'm gonna give you about 20 to 30 seconds of silence to think about an experience and to think about some keywords that you would use to describe that, about how you felt. So here we go. So I hope I'm not interrupting too many good conversations across the country, but you know, I've asked groups of people to reflect on this from really diverse settings, actually even in this past month. So from school settings to, I spoke at my church on International Women's Day weekend and other settings. And people, you know, I think we think about how we do engagement and sometimes get concerned, and people get, you know, it can sometimes feel like an overwhelming process, but I think we all actually know what it feels like to be engaged well. And so I'm hoping that you come up with words that, you know, might include trusting, empowering, heard, listened to. People talk a lot about, you know, their best experiences of when they feel prepared or when they feel like their passion for an issue is matched by the passion of the folks that they're meeting with. So whatever you came up with, I'm sure that we all know what it's felt like to be well engaged. And we also have probably been in engagement processes where it hasn't felt like it's been genuine or authentic. And so maybe just to hold the positive words with you as we go through the presentation. And so I'm not going to read all these points on the slide, but the question period, and a lot of people on the call who have contributed to writing about youth engagement, both in practice and in academic circles. But overall, if you ever need to convince someone that youth engagement is important or works or essential, you know, there's a lot of evidence across sectors, mental health, health promotion, political science, others, that youth engagement is both positive for young people and for the services they use. And for policy outcomes and what have you. And so we think about youth engagement building resilience and amplifying protective factors amongst more marginalized young people. We see that can increase social inclusion and social connection, and thus, again, creating protective factors. Like I said, I'm not going to go point by point. I do think that along with the general feeling that it works, and we know it works because we studied it in many different ways. Also looking at different organizations who have done different types of participatory evaluations of their youth engagement structures. And then it also is really important then, and that we're going to spend most of today talking about how you ensure that that engagement process is appropriate and beneficial and respects the rights of young people, no matter which community or identity they come from. And so I think there is also evidence about how you engage young people who come from more marginalized settings in a way that amplifies the benefit of the exercise. So I'll leave that there and continue on. And I think this is back to you, Faye.
Yeah, I also want to build off what Lisa was saying around, I think, I worry that we sometimes think of youth engagement as something that is like fun and cozy and like it looks pretty to do it. And so I love the research because it backs up the fact that it is both the right thing to do, but it is also the efficient thing to do. It will lead to better services. It will lead to more resilient young folks. And I think is forgotten sometimes when we talk about youth engagement and these like, yay, engage the youth. It's so great to engage the youth kind of ways. But that's just my side note. So on the screen now, you'll see Hart's ladder, which we also use as Hart's star. So this is a model to think about youth engagement. And it's one of the more popular ones and most used ones in like youth engagement, in the youth engagement world these days, I would say. It was initially structured as a ladder to kind of demonstrate the different like steps that and like levels that youth engagement happens on. But we tried to shift it, or I don't actually know who, somebody shifted it into a star, basically to reflect the fact that meaningful engagement can happen in a lot of different contexts. And so the star here is essentially a model to think through the parameters and like the kinds of engagement opportunities that we have for young people. So a lot of the time we think of partnership as like the ideal, right? Like we're engaging young folks, we're engaging service providers or adults as equal partners in an initiative where they are sharing power, where they are entirely on the same page, helping each other out. It's an entirely balanced, equal partnership. And that is often what we strive towards, and there's a lot of value and meaning in that. But we also know that there's situations where an initiative will be youth initiated, where young folks want to do an engagement and do a project that is youth-led, that they are taking the full leadership around, or when they want, adults or service providers involved, but as advisors and consultants to, lend some of their resources, but maybe not actually have equal power in those dynamics. On the other hand, that we know that in our sectors, in the work that we do, we aren't always able to entirely share power. We know that there are situations where engagement will be and has to be initiated by adults. And we know that's not a bad thing. And so it's less about, like what the exact nature of the power balance is. It's more about clarity and accountability. It's about being transparent about the dynamic and the role and influence that young people have in a particular opportunity. We also know that youth engagement can be about consulting and informing young folks. So I think a lot about like focus groups or consultations where we're trying to hear and uplift the voices of young folks and hopefully engaging them in a few different ways and mechanisms throughout an initiative. But where sometimes a young person's involvement with a project is about advising on a document or the creation of a report. And again, we think of that as meaningful because of the fact that as long as we're being transparent, as long as we're being clear about what that role is and what's going to be, like what the scope of that project is, it can still be an incredibly meaningful experience for that young person. And the same thing around being assigned but informed. So I think the STAR is essentially just a way to think through and be more intentional about how we are engaging young people, and just to remind us that we want to be clear about those parameters to make that engagement meaningful. Now, at the bottom of the STAR, you see the three negative forms of youth engagement, which are just like basically mechanisms to make us aware of when we might be going into not quite so meaningful territory. So the first one is tokenism. What that looks like in action is usually, engaging a single young person as the representative of all young people, or engaging, a set of young folks where you only have one young person who isn't a white person or straight or cisgender or any of those things, where the engagement of different youth is very much because exclusively of the desire to have somebody who can represent that entire community. In the middle, we have manipulation. That's essentially when we don't give that clarity and transparency, where we don't create that sandbox or like the parameters around somebody's engagement. A lot of the time I see it when we really like hype up how an initiative is going to change the world, but the project funding isn't there to engage the young person for more than 2 months. And so I see it when we aren't being clear and transparent about what we actually can deliver on or what the real parameters of our project are. The last one is my personal pet peeve, which is decoration. I think of it as, you know, when a young person, when an organization engages a bunch of young folks, because they really want that nice photo op. They want that pretty picture that they can send out in their newsletter and send out in their annual report, when they haven't really, that looks like they're engaging these diverse youth, but they might not have actually engaged those young folks. And it might really just be an opportunity to make them look good without delivering on the meaningful engagement that should go hand in hand with that. And so that's essentially the STAR. I think it's a useful tool for self-reflection and just to be intentional about how and why we are engaging young people and what kinds of roles we are engaging them in.
And Faye, before you flip to the next slide, can I just hop in with a couple of points? So this is the challenge of not being in the same room when you're delivering a webinar, but we made plans for being able to pop in. So I think sometimes what I hear when organizations come to Wisdom to Action seeking support around their youth engagement work, sometimes you know, there's sort of two trends, I guess. And one is that people come and they really, they're at the sort of assigned but informed or consulted and informed. And so that's sort of the level of engagement that they might always have used for youth or for other community types of engagement, but also again, like not thinking through about how to do that well and do that with intent known and with adequate resources. Or so often I will have conversations with people where they're like, we could never have partnership, or we'll never get to youth initiated, so maybe we just shouldn't try or start or that sort of thing. And so I think one of the things, I mean, I think I pulled apart the ladder at a certain point, but other people across, in this world have been doing that too. I think that all of these forms can be valid forms, because I think one of the worst things that happens in youth engagement initiatives is when a project is put in place that hasn't been well planned and isn't well resourced, or maybe people don't even really know what the resource needs might be, and thus they haven't been matched by resources. And so it's just the intent isn't clear, the outcome isn't clear, and the efforts aren't put into making the most of the opportunity that's there. And so I really encourage, if people think they can't get to youth initiated from the start, I think sometimes that's okay, because it's better to start where your organization is and your community is and what they can deliver on. So,
love it. Awesome. So our next piece is a bit about anti-oppression in youth engagement. The big piece here is, so when I think about anti-oppression, it's again one of those terms that is like thrown around a lot, just like inclusion and diversity, without really thinking through what it means and what the real meat of it is. And so anti-oppression to me is essentially an awareness that our world is fundamentally shaped by forces of oppression, including but not limited to systems like racism, sexism, classism, transphobia, homophobia, ableism, and like the giant plethora of other unpleasant forces that impact the everyday realities of our communities. And it's not just about having an awareness that those things abstractly exist, but it's about acknowledging that oppression has filtered into every aspect of our society. That includes how we think about things. As folks who might come from different privileges, our very ability to contribute in spaces, our very desire and like the belief that we have a right to be in a space, the right to speak up in a space, even like the idea that we can be safe leaving our houses and like walking through the streets of our city, very much comes from the privilege that we hold. And so I think it's about, anti-oppression is about acknowledging and trying to unpack some of that, to be mindful about how our privileges have shaped the opportunities that we have, and how the lack of those privileges for other people might fundamentally shape the lack of opportunities that those young folks might have. It's also about understanding that these don't like exist in siloed boxes. You know, we don't, like, people aren't just impacted by racism or by sexism or by classism, but they're impacted by these forces as they intersect with each other. And so what I mean by that is that the experiences of a gay man might be very different from the experiences of a Black gay man. Or of a poor gay man, or a young person who is street involved, as a lot of us will probably know, has a very different frame of reference than a young person who is like stably housed. And so that makes it even more difficult for a young person who might be street involved and identify as LGBTQ. And the barriers that they face and the opportunities they have access to are significantly impacted by the identities and experiences of marginalization they might hold. So anti-oppression as an approach and as a framework isn't about, you know, setting up an ideal around like, yay, we're going to liberate the entire world and have the perfect framework and approach to doing justice to everybody. It's more about striving to create an approach that doesn't leave anyone out. There we go. It's not about like this perfect theory or framework, because I don't think that theory or framework exists. I think that oppression is really complicated and that we live in a really complicated and nuanced world. But committing to working through an anti-oppressive approach is about saying, we know that these systems exist, we know that they fundamentally shape the everyday realities of young people in our communities, and we know that we need to do the best that we can to most meaningfully engage, support, and affirm young people from these intersecting identities. I'm really not used to webinars where I can't like check in with folks, but I'm hoping this works for everyone so far because I'm rambling. It's like I'm used to like working with an audience that I can like look at and be like, you're nodding along with me, but I'm sure y'all are loving this. The other piece is that, you know, we can talk about like the theory of anti-oppression forever, but a lot of it is actually enacted in safer spaces. And so safer spaces are, you know, it used to be called a safe space. We now added an R on there to make it a little bit more inclusive. But a safer space isn't, you know, a guarantee of safety or inclusion. A safer space is a guarantee that you are striving towards more safety and more inclusive. The reason that we call them safer spaces is because when we're convening a group of people, be they like young folks or any group of folks, we can't really guarantee that anybody's going to be safe in that space because we don't know the folks who are entering into a particular space. We also, again, know that oppression and violence is a really complicated reality, and that we can't really guarantee that we have unlearned all of the things that we might want to, or that we are able to fully meet the needs of every young person in the room. And so creating a safer space is, again, about trying to create an environment where people can bring their full selves into a space, be supported, included, and affirmed as best as possible. But again, at the end of the day, a safer space isn't a guarantee. There's no way that we can possibly say that every young person who enters our services, who enters this space or engages in this initiative will be meaningfully supported every step of the way. But we can strive and we can build the relationships that allow for us to revisit and reorient those spaces to be as safe as possible. And so that brings me to my last point on this slide, which is that safer spaces are, at best, in the ideal situations, co-created. What I mean by that is that I think a lot of us tend to, you know, when we're trying to create a safer space, we put a piece of chart paper on the wall and we say, be nice to each other, don't be rude, don't say any slurs, and then we're like, perfect, safer space. But it's not really efficient or like productive to dictate a safer space. We have to, as best as we can, co-create them, because that means that we're all buying into those spaces. It also means that every safer space that we create is going to be generated based off the needs, the goals, and the intentions of the people in the room. And so instead of being this abstraction, this like idea of, yay, we're going to be nice to each other, it is a tangible agreement that we enter into as a collective to say, we are striving to be inclusive of everyone here. We're doing the best that we can to do that. And we've co-created guidelines that we are now all going to be accountable to do the best that we can to ensure the best experience for everyone in the room. And so I think that is essentially just how to, like, a way of reorienting our understanding of safer spaces to be a bit more intentional about creating them and making sure that they reflect the needs of young folks that we're engaging with. And now for the next piece, I'll pass it back to Lisa.
Great, thanks. And I wanted to say too, sort of building on the idea of safer space. So one of the projects that Faye and I have been working on over the past few months is on behalf of the Public Health Agency of Canada, and we've been engaging LGBTQ2S+ young people across the country on their priorities on gender-based violence. And so while we've had a number of in-person sessions and provided support to young people to sort of self-organize, to host discussions across the country and provide those young people with support around creating safer spaces. We've also had the experience of how do you do this online, actually. So we had, I think, almost 500 young people respond to an online survey within a short period of time. And then also we've offered the opportunity to all those young people then to be part of the analysis and to think about recommendations. And so we've had this very iterative, ongoing process. And at the same time, really, I think Faye and I acknowledging that we're inviting young people to contemplate, potentially some of the most challenging and traumatic experiences of their lives and their connection to it. So that's been a particularly challenging thing to contemplate. Obviously, we provide things like kids' help phone lines and that sort of thing as places to get support. But I think as well, part of what's been particularly important is that despite the fact that we haven't all been in a room, we've done a lot of co-creation along the way. So how would you like to be engaged next? What should this look like? And so we've actually been able to take the process out of the room and make it more virtual. And I think, again, this is a great example of an issue that people are absolutely passionate about and want to be heard on, and that they are ready to engage. And then and so I think that's been really an interesting process. So and I'll just quickly touch on anything that I think Faye hasn't already covered in terms of how do we build safer spaces. So I think the first point, and for those of us who've worked in a number of different contexts, like in government and in the private sector and in nonprofit, and as well on university campuses or college campuses. So safer spaces don't just benefit youth. Obviously, when we learn better as organizations how to acknowledge and address an anti-oppressive approach and a commitment to diversity and inclusion, really organizations benefit. And I think, as Faye, talked about with the previous slide, also committing to being a learning organization. So looking at practices, inviting feedback, co-creating the next step, I think is really important. And we had planning on the slide, because obviously that all doesn't happen like magic. You really have to build towards policies and procedures that you're learning from all the time and adding to that allow you to actually deliver on different types of engagement, whether that's short-term or long-term. And I think the other piece that I would just emphasize on this slide is building relationships with diverse communities. So I've also been in settings with organizations who really feel like they would like to have better access to different diverse voices, but don't have a history of relationship with that community. And I always talk about starting before you start. Like I think that's really where you need to focus. And if communities aren't interested, and this whatever it is, a policy, a project, what have you, if it's not a priority for them, to be very respectful of that, because that's also an important part of building those relationships. I think it's back to you, Faye, at this point. I don't know. Let me just check my notes. Do you want to cover this slide?
Yeah, for sure. So again, I think we can talk all day about like safer spaces, but I think it's good to give actually tangible takeaways and action items. I think first and foremost, safer spaces don't happen in a vacuum. They happen through the development of meaningful, authentic relationships. Throughout all of our youth engagement work, that is a primary piece that we emphasize. Youth engagement has to be built on getting to know the young people you're engaging with, their needs, not just in terms of the project that you're working on, but what they're looking to, what are they in school, what are their interests, what are their passions, and building that trust, respect, and communication, so that if there are things that happen, if there are experiences that aren't so negative, aren't so inclusive, or aren't so positive, They feel like they trust you and respect you enough to have that conversation with you, and that there are pathways of communication to ensure that that can happen, and then they can then take that and do something with it to improve or rectify a problem. I think that as service providers, we need to engage in education and critical self-reflection, both to unpack our own bias and investigate our privilege, which I think is that piece around critical self-reflection, but also to get the information that we need to work with different communities. Different communities have different needs and experiences, and we need to spend the time before or as we're engaging with marginalized young folks and organizations to make sure that we know how to respectfully do that work. We shouldn't just be jumping into it without reflecting on how to do it meaningfully and how to do it right in the first place. I've already talked a bit about co-creating community guidelines, but at the end of the day, I think it's really about, again, accountability, transparency, and honesty. Mistakes happen. In a lot of the work that I do, I spend a lot of my time giving a workshop that's essentially how to be decent to trans kids, targeted at social services and children and youth mental health in particular. And the thing that I keep pumping up against is that we're really afraid to make mistakes. As service providers, particularly as social workers, as people who come into this work with a lot of passion and a desire to make change and improve the realities of young folks, we're really terrified to screw up. We're really terrified to put our foot in our mouth, or our feet in our mouth, to do any of those things. And at the end of the day, we need to acknowledge that those mistakes are going to happen. They will always happen. But what matters is how we deal with them. It's the relationships that we build through our mistakes. It's the learning that comes from it. And it's being accountable, transparent, and honest when those mistakes happen that I think is most crucial to doing this work right and to making sure that we're meeting the needs of the marginalized young folks that we're working with. In terms of more operational considerations, I think a lot of the time we forget that young folks often don't have vehicles, for one. It's hard for young people to get out to things, and there's a lot of operational barriers that can present themselves to get in the way of meaningful engagement. I think that, for one, we don't always do a good job of emphasizing the fact that we are trying to engage meaningfully with diverse young people. I think a lot of those external demonstrations of from how we're talking about gender to how we're reaching out and engaging and celebrating different key annual events that have meaning to different communities is really important. Having posters that say that we respect LGBTQ young people, that we are aware of accessibility needs, or of the fact that, this is a washroom that somebody with a wheelchair probably can't fit in, and that we're upfront about those things is really important. Spending some time at the get-go to think about physical accessibility, to think about if the event that we're hosting is near a transit route so that somebody can bus there. Thinking through if there's gender-neutral washrooms so that trans and gender-diverse young folks aren't forced to choose between one or the other. But also thinking about things like mental health support and acknowledging that a lot of marginalized young folks, when we're engaging them on issues like teen dating violence or mental health or gender-based violence, there is a lot of trauma connected to those issues, and that a lot of young people have very significant negative experiences. And so thinking about mental health support and how we can create a structure where young folks aren't forced to be in conversations where they might find something triggering, and if they do, they can get access to supports to help them do better and feel better after. At the end of the day, operational considerations around safer spaces is really about asking yourself the question of what barriers exist that we haven't mitigated. It depends on every situation. There is no checklist, or there is no one solution to creating accessible, inclusive spaces. But if we spend our time thinking through that question every step of the way in a project or an initiative that we're working on, I think that gets us somewhere really good to ensure that we're really doing this engagement right.
And Faye, I might just hop in there. So one of the questions that we always ask, so we might ask about various different accessibility issues and more broadly in terms of also childcare and other things. But then we also always have a question when we're convening groups is there anything else that we can do to support your participation? It might be slightly more eloquent than that, but what's really interesting is that people often they do know what they need. And so people will often identify, I don't want to have to talk all the time. I need a quiet space. And so when you really invite that, I find it really interesting that even if you're not, you're not sort of co-creating necessarily directly with someone who's signing up to come to something until you meet them. But even that starts a conversation. So I've been watching time, and I think we're a little bit close to time, and we want to make sure we have time for questions. And so, Faye, with your permission, would you mind if I showed the video to get some of the operational issues, and then we can turn to questions? So here we're going to play a little bit with the technology, folks, and hopefully it all works out fine. There we go. So since it seems to be working, quick intro. So one of the more visible ways of our work and that we've worked with young people has been through an event series called Wisdom to Action. Perhaps some of you have attended them. We hosted an event in February of 2018 in Vancouver called Embrace Life. And this really came from our Youth Advisory Committee, who wanted to look at youth-led suicide prevention. So a lot of our YAC members are professionals in suicide prevention and in peer support. And so this was an event that a youth team came together around, designed the event and hosted the event. And so this is a youth host just talking a bit about that. So it also gives you a sense of some of the facilitation techniques I think we had hoped to talk a little bit about today, and we might not get to. So you'll see it in action.
Hi, my name is Dana Turdy, and I'm part of the youth host team for the Wisdom to Action Embrace Life event in Vancouver. So during this event, the focus was on youth-led suicide prevention and how we approach that. And we gathered for 2 days on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, and we are very grateful to do that on these territories and to have First Nation communities and Indigenous youth come from all across Canada and from the north. So we also had frontline support workers. We have people from the Ministry of Education. It's been really amazing, and it's awesome to see the collaborative effort from everyone and from such diverse backgrounds and communities. So our objectives were essentially to share promising practices in youth-led suicide prevention, and we connected and felt support and built relationships with each other. And we did this through activities such as open space, where essentially the participators get to choose what they want to talk about, and anyone can join a conversation. And fishbowl, where you get to observe a conversation in the middle of the big circle and just listen and feel heard. Also World Cafe, where there are small groups exploring questions that were predetermined. It's having conversations about those kind of questions, as well as through presentations from all different kinds of organizations. So we had jack.org, and we had the Red Cross give a presentation. So Michael Kuskak talked about his experience as a children's author with Indigenous topics, and also the Urban Native Youth Association, who danced and sang and played music for us. So yeah, it was just an amazing event to be part of.
So I thought it's often just useful from, to actually sort of see some of that in action. And so that the youth team, for instance, had, I don't know if you saw on Dana's face, she had a little red sticker. And so over the course of the 2 days, the youth team all had experience, for instance, in peer support mechanisms. And so in addition to the mental health support that we had in the room, they also wanted to indicate that they were available for peer support. We had a quiet space that was set up for people to hang out if they wanted that. And we spent a lot of time, as you can see, in sort of small group work. And I also say that we, with the youth team, made decisions along the way that actually sort of changed what we wanted to focus on from day 1 to day 2. So it was quite emergent and responsive to the needs in the room. So I know it's 1:44. Faye, is there anything else from our last few slides that you wanted to highlight before we turn it over to some questions?
I'm thinking maybe we can jump just to the engaging diverse young folks, the key considerations, and then recruiting diverse young folks. And I can give a general overview because I think there's some valuable takeaways for those.
Okay, yep, go ahead.
Actually, can you do the one slide before this?
That one?
Yeah, awesome. So just around engaging diverse youth, I think when I I've been in the youth engagement world for a while. A lot of the time we think about young folks who are really outgoing, excited, positive youth as like the young folks that we most engage with. And I think it's important to move away from that and to acknowledge that the young people who aren't as vocal aren't less engaged. They're just young folks who might engage differently. And that to make sure that that engagement is meaningful, we just need to think about how we facilitate discussions that allow young people to engage differently. As you saw from the Wisdom to Action video, our facilitation technique is really about bringing people together and equalizing those power dynamics and playing fields. We also have chart paper at every discussion. We have pipe cleaners, we have fidget toys of all sorts. And so really thinking through reducing those practical barriers has been really meaningful for us. In terms of how to convene groups a bit more in practice, if you can jump 2 slides ahead. Perfect. Some key pieces are having conversations around pronouns and access needs. So pronouns being, we introduced ours at the start, pronouns like she and her, they, them, he, him, and basically setting up a conversation so that we know that young folks who use pronouns different from what we might presume or assume based off how they would present are still welcome in a space. Access needs are another newer thing, essentially as a way to, in an introduction, ask folks what they need to access and engage fully in a space. So it can be things like, I need time before you ask me to speak. I need to be able to think about things. I need to be able to fidget or stand up and leave or walk around or lie down on the floor in the middle of a conversation. And those are things that help me engage meaningfully. It's also about creating inviting and comfortable spaces, having, as I said, things like fidget toys. But at the end of the day, it's really about acknowledging that young folks have a diversity of needs that we can never perfectly meet, and giving them, like trusting them and supporting them to know their bodies best and know their needs best. At a Wisdom to Action space, some people have on occasion raised their hand and said hey, can I go to the washroom? And we're just yes, you can do whatever you need to do. Our spaces are not conventional spaces where you need to ask to do something that your body needs you to do. If folks need to spend the day walking around and not really say anything, or jump from one conversation to the next throughout the entire day, they're welcome to do that. And creating a space that allows that to happen means that a lot of young folks feel like they can bring their full selves into the events and into the opportunities. And that has such value both for us in terms of the data that we take and the messaging and the takeaways and learning that we take from every event. But also, I've seen the development of a young person at the start of a Wisdom to Action event. I've seen very quiet young folks who don't typically engage, going from that to being some of the most vocal young folks who are taking the mic, who are speaking to the room, and really creating a space that allows them to step in, but without pressuring them to do so, is one of the most valuable things that I've ever witnessed. And so I think really thinking through how we engage young people in different ways is incredibly valuable. Now, for the last piece, I know that a big issue, as somebody who's been working in youth engagement for a while, we're not good at recruiting diverse young people. I see it in the work that I do. I joke a lot of the time when I go to youth engagement conferences that it's really great, but I would love to see somebody that I don't already know in these events. Because it's a small sector of young folks who are jumping into these engagement opportunities. And I think we need to be intentional about shifting away from that. I want to go to an event and not see any of my friends there, or not reconnect with young people who I've seen at the last conference the year before and the year before and the year before. And to do that, we need to think about linking with local youth-led and youth-engaged organizations, particularly ones that work with marginalized communities, because those organizations exist in all of our communities, and they have the relationships and they have the young people engaged with them that would really help our work and that we could also use to help their work. And so it's about building relationships with organizations focused on particular communities and making sure that those relationships are reciprocal. A lot of the time I think that we get very excited about the projects that we're working on, but we don't realize that when we're working with marginalized groups and marginalized organizations, even our underfunded, underserved sectors usually have a step up over them. And that it's important that when we're engaging with these organizations, not only are we getting something out of it, but they're getting something meaningful and valuable out of it for themselves organizationally, but also for themselves as broader communities and for the young people engaged in their organization as well. At the end of the day, it's about indeed asking yourselves, asking the young people who are engaging with why they might not have chosen to participate, or young people who turn down an opportunity, why they aren't engaging in it. It's about having those conversations with organizations too. If you're promoting an organization, opportunity and you notice that an organization you reached out to isn't there, have a conversation about what to do better next time. And at the end of the day, it's really just about being intentional in our outreach and our recruitment, and it's about emphasizing our commitment to diversity year-round. You know, we will never, it's very hard to engage the perfect demographic of every demographic. That doesn't really happen, and so we will never do this perfectly. But the ongoing commitment and striving to do the best that we can and being accountable and transparent about that is what we need to do to build those meaningful relationships, to do better at diversity, and really ensure that we're engaging young people from diverse identities as meaningfully and valuably as possible. And that, at exactly 12:50, is my diversity spiel.
So I think we're ready for questions now. And as you will get copies of these slides. So I think I need to turn the system back to Wendy.
Yes.
There we go.
You don't want to show my screen. Great. Well, I want to say thank you. Really, really valuable information, and I really appreciate the expertise and the passion in which in the way that you talk about your work and that you do your work. And there were so many learnings, but I guess one of the ones that I always glob onto, being PREVNet, is talking about the importance and salience of relationships, and that it's got to be authentic, these relationships. And I think that's the foundation of success. And I think it's probably the number one thing in my mind as I listen to you that would be important. The other thing in creating those relationships is acknowledging the power dynamics that might exist and being aware of that to make them successful was another important learning. And I also really appreciated the very practical yet important and critical information that you shared. We do have some questions, so I'm going to give you the first question. Which is, I'm just reading it. Love the idea of building youth engagement into organizational culture. Can you provide examples of effective agency level policies that promote youth engagement?
I think so. Did you want to start it off, Lisa? Or?
No, go ahead.
I think that there's a ton of different ways to meaningfully engage young people on an organizational level. I am indeed always a fan of, I love youth action or advisory committees, but I also think that it's not enough to just have a committee that we occasionally refer to. And so when it comes to youth advisory committees, I recommend embedding them in your governance structure so that they're being consulted and that their green light on projects or that their advice on projects is not just something that you should listen to, but something that your bylaws say you have to listen to. Not always, again, it's a conversation, but making sure it's embedded in your policies is really crucial. But also making sure that we're not just having young people engaged in a youth advisory committee. Whenever Wisdom to Action organizes an event, we have usually a planning team, a youth host team, and who knows how many other teams that might just pop up as needed. And we always try to have young people engaged on every single level. And so having young people on boards of directors, having young people on staff, having young people in every level of an organization as best as possible, I think is a practice that I've seen really help organizations stay committed to and do justice to meaningful engagement.
Yeah, I think just to echo Faye, and so I don't know if the person with the question was looking for specific examples of specific policies, and maybe we can provide those as a follow-up. But I think if you're able to support an ongoing youth advisory structure that is part of your governance structure. So in our case, it was it was on the org chart, it was part of our governing board, and then policies that support that set out things like obligations on both sides. So like you would with any other sort of committee that you might have as part of your governance structure. So in terms of how often should people meet, what does the facilitation of that group look like, what are the organization's obligations, and to also think about what's the capacity for a financial commitment. And I think, in our case with Wisdom to Action as an example, and I know lots of others that are similar. I mean, often the question also that you need to come back to time and time again is, so invite the discussion around what is your role, what do you see as your role, co-convene boards and youth advisories together to have those conversations. So we can send you specific agency level policies, but I do think thinking about embedding youth advisory functions into a structure is great, but staffing them and resourcing them adequately is also really critical.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, you've actually made a really nice transition into the next question, which was, you mentioned resourcing projects appropriately. I wonder if there are any parameters for funding that help people think about resourcing projects appropriately.
I mean, people often ask me those questions too. And in terms of, if I want to have a youth engaged event, like how much would that cost or that sort of thing. And obviously, it's very project specific, but I think, thinking about a lot of the things that we've just discussed. So, we also, Faye and I, and a whole bunch of other people, some of whom are probably on this call, worked together on a Wisdom to Action event on youth engagement last year as well. And we worked closely with Holland Bloorview in Toronto, which is a children's rehabilitation hospital, and they have an amazing youth advisory structure, just to give a little shout out to Holland Bloorview. But they, thinking about things like everything from like attendance to ASL to childcare. I mean, so sometimes those costs you can't predict because you kind of don't know what they might be based on demand. But you won't ever get people asking for them unless you make them available. So, so I think that's an important part. So, I can, certainly, you need to think about your budget. There's also often a question around, do you financially compensate young people for their engagement in different projects? In general, my approach is that we try and compensate young people for a lot of the work. So youth hosts, for instance, are compensated. And, with our youth advisory committee, I actually left it to them to sort of think about how they saw their role. And I don't think they would mind me sharing. So what they agreed was that when they met as a youth advisory committee, that they wanted to be volunteering, and they didn't want financial compensation. That wasn't how they saw that commitment. When the two co-chairs sat on our governing board, they did want an honoraria, which I think, if you think about any type of community engagement, if you convene a table of people for like a day or a couple of days, and some people arrive with their salary and some people don't, I think it's really important it's really important to reduce barriers. So at the same time, I guess I always don't want people to be frightened by expense when they're thinking about this work, but definitely like when you're submitting project plans to funders and that sort of thing, to ensure that you fund youth engagement well is important. So.
Okay, I have another question from Hillary. I was wondering if there were any other models besides Hart's ladder that you have found helpful and more encompassing of anti-oppressive practice in your youth engagement process. For example, critical youth empowerment or Wong and Zimmerman's pyramid.
So I have done some thinking around like the role of positive youth development, and then those principles, but also critical positive youth development as well. I'm actually not familiar with the other triangle that was just mentioned, but I think there's Hartwood has another example. So I think there are different models out there, and I think we use Hart's. I mean, partially I like to keep using Hart's as a model too, because I don't like it being presented as a ladder, because I think it scares a lot of people off. So I always like to be like, I know you've seen that one, but look, we can think about it in a new way. So I think, I think like I said, there's a lot of research out there, and having a chance to really consider your model is so, like, just being like intentional about choosing a model that works for your project is really important. And there's a lot of resources out there that can support that. Faye, have you worked with other sort of conceptual models?
Not around anti-oppression. Unfortunately, if people have some, I would love to see them. But I think from my experience, I think I don't exist in academia so much. And so most of my learning is anti-oppression are very just community-based, and from the work that I happen to be doing. So I haven't seen any other models that I would recommend.
Okay, and I'm going to squeeze in one last final question if you two have the endurance. Mm-hmm. When working with younger youth, like age 12 to 15, how would you suggest balancing allowing youth to do what they need to do and take the space they need, like leaving conversations or leaving the event completely, when having requirements for adult supervision? And that's a question from Aaron.
Well, yeah. So I think, I mean, I think there's definitely context where, you know, you need to, like with younger children or even younger than 12, think about safety issues. So I think that's often where, at least having a quiet space, we have often also looked for event spaces, for instance, where there's also some outdoor space. And then it goes back to sort of adequately planning around, I mean, I've been searching recently for a better word than chaperoning, but basically having chaperones, having adults, trusted adults or older youth available. So if that young person needs to take a break, that they can do so safely. And I don't think there's anything, you know, I think that's definitely a balance that needs to be struck. You know, I've worked with young people who have autism and want to be in part of engagement activities, and definitely, you know, often need a break and a walk around the block and that sort of thing. And so just making sure that there's an elder youth or an adult available to do that is important.
Okay. Well, thank you both so much. It was wonderful to hear from you, from your experiences and your expertise. And as I said, your passion is so clear. So thank you, Lisa and Faye. And on behalf of all of us, I know that we're walking away having learned something. And hopefully what I hope each of you will not only have learned it, but will you start to execute it into practice, at least 2 or 3 very practical suggestions that you've given us. So I also like to thank the listeners for being so attentive and asking really wonderful questions. And I'd like to remind you to do the evaluation survey. That tells us what we do well and what we need to do better. So we take that information very seriously. And lastly, just to let you know, we will be sending out the slides and the link so that you can listen to the webinar again. And we are building some, I know that Lisa and Faye have been building some fact sheets that are quick summaries of some of their key points that we will also be sharing. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we look forward to our next seminar. Stay tuned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, folks.